We're taking some time to look at what we might call a spiritual hierarchy of needs, and how the wilderness experience that we go through shapes some of those development aspects, those healthy growth aspects in us. And if the first foundation that we need to lay is a sense of a healthy dependence, the second stage I want to suggest to you is discovering a healthy security in God. There is a sense that our character is formed by the experiences we have growing up. To explain what I mean by that a little bit, we can use some of the ideas of how we form bonds as children and the experiences we have and map those onto our spiritual journey. So remembering that wildernesses are this place of learning to depend on God, I also believe they're a place that help us to learn and shape our security in God. So as children, if we consider the amount of freedom we're given, different parents have differing levels of freedom. Some parents have this sort of very laissez-faire where anything goes, and other parents can be extremely controlling and control everything that goes on. And the amount of freedom we experience as babies and as toddlers shapes whether we grow up to be independent or codependent, whether we have a healthy sense of being able to go into the world and explore the world, or whether we find ourselves dependent on other human beings. And often we have to do ministry with people who have found that their entire identity is shaped by being dependent on finding their value and worth through other people's perspectives of them. So there's an independence or a codependence that develops based on the amount of freedom we get. Similarly, as children growing up, we experiment and we learn through trial and error. And the responses that we get and the lessons that we learn through that trial and error and how other people sort of react to us shape whether we grow up to be resilient or vulnerable, whether we grow up to have that sense of we can try things, and if they go wrong we have the resilience to push through and to try again and go again, or whether we find ourselves so vulnerable that the thought of failure sort of cripples us. Again, those things are shaped in our early years by what we experience from the people around us. Similarly, it is similar with the idea of encouragement. The amount of encouragement we get as children, I suppose a very simple thing would be when you're learning to walk. Do you get that sense of, come on, come on, come on, yeah, fantastic. Oh dear, you fell over, come on, get up, have another go. Or whether you get that sense of, oh, you're a failure, come on, you can do better, and you should be walking by now. It's a very simplistic picture. But the amount of encouragement we get shapes whether we grow up with a sense of self-confidence or insecurity. If we're constantly criticised as children, we can grow up to have a very insecure view of the world. And similarly, the values that we experience as young toddlers also shape our morality and shape our sense of the values that we go into adult life with. I work with a lot of people who, working with people coming through the criminal justice system, it's very easy to have to cast a judgment on people, to say they've committed heinous crimes and we need to throw the book at them, string them up from a lamppost, or we're better off having the locking them up for life, or whatever your sort of phraseology is. And there's a lot of intolerance for people who've committed some pretty horrific crimes. And I'm not in any way minimising the impact on the victims for those crimes. They are horrible, and there is a need for the law to bring justice in those situations. But when I look at the stories of the people that I work with, many of them have grown up where their early formative years, the people around them, the family around them, their morality and their sense of the values and what they were doing were skewed. And consequently, people that I work with have grown up with the morality being corrupt and consequently being exposed to things that children should never ever be experienced to. That then leads in their later years to them going on to commit crimes. And when you start to understand some of the horror that some of the people I work with have grown up with, you start to discover a compassion. God's character is to heal and redeem our past. And we will say, that the grace of God means that there is no one beyond the forgiveness and grace of God, no matter what they've done. If they turn to God in repentance, God can heal their past, redeem their past, and give them a future. And we can discover a personal security in God that no matter what our past has been and what our experiences have been, we can discover a wholeness and a health in God as we learn to trust Him and discover that security. The exposure of the wilderness invites us to develop the life skills and the sense of survival skills that are a spiritual mirror of what happens as children, so that our early Christian experience in the wilderness shapes how we grow up to be spiritually strong and healthy. Elijah had to move from the brook to Zarephath. He'd gone into the wilderness and God had provided for him, and he'd started to discover that security. But there came a place where he had to move from that place to a new place. And sometimes we're afraid to move forward. We've learned to trust God in one thing, and God invites us to take the next step of the journey. But sometimes we're afraid to grow. We're afraid to step into that next step. And Elijah had to learn to trust God in Zarephath as he had at the Kerith ravine. He had to learn to cope when, having seen the miracle of the oil and the flour being multiplied and never running out, and God's provision, suddenly this widow, her only son, dies. And Elijah's suddenly placed in this position where the widow who's caring for him has lost the most important thing in the world to her, her only son. And what does Elijah do in that situation? There's no past heritage, there's no past example. And Elijah does something that's never ever been seen before. He cries out to God, intercedes to God, and raises the widow's son from the dead. The first example of being raised from the dead in the Bible. Elijah, in his wilderness experience, had to move from that learning the dependence to discovering a security in God that whatever happened, he had that sense of knowing that God was in it. He developed his God story, and his experiences in the wilderness shaped his trust and his faith. And it allowed him to develop a healthy security in God. And if we are going to grow in God, just like our hero John is, John's going into the wilderness to discover the things that Elijah discovered to help him face the ministry and the journey that lies ahead. And if we're going to grow and become healthy disciples and followers of God, we need to discover something about security of God and the wilderness allows us to develop that sense of being able to know God with us, whatever we face in life. We need to learn to be secure in God. And I guess my question to you today is, how secure do you feel in God? If you've learned to depend on God, have you got that security in God that allows you to take the next step of faith that God might invite you to?